As the Prime Minister today's debate, please in my speech, first setting this debate up, then providing a short preemptive rebuttal, and then lastly, two constructive arguments for the proposition bench. One, representation of diverse groups, and two, the encouragement of public engagement in politics. So moving on to setting this debate up. Firstly, some characterization of the key terms and today's status quo. First, characterizing the rise. Let's emphasize this. We're not necessarily forcing these political outsiders to run for president or something. It's just like they express their opinions to represent groups and to be heard by the current politicians or the government. Two, political outsiders. This is someone who does not grow up under or get in touch with politics before. They haven't spent a lot of time in political landmarks, but they spend that amount of time, like 30 years or decades, in the real world in their own respective fields. And three, the status quo of politics today. This most leaders have grown up in a bubble and they are not really engaged with the outside world. So they don't forget what it's like to worry about taxes, monthly bills, or stuff just like ordinary people. Now, moving on to some stakeholder analysis. First, the stakeholder of regular citizens. What is their incentive? They want their problems, they want their social problems like low quality of education or high prices or inflation to be heard and to be solved. But on the other hand, they're often living in a bubble and they don't engage actively in politics. Their capacity is that they have the power of vote, but they're currently gaining more and more distrust towards the government because they are not seeing anyone who looks like them or speaks like them, so they feel underrepresented. Now, the second stakeholder of political parties, their incentive is that they want to win elections and keep the power. Capacity is that they currently have all the money and power, but they're stuck in outdated ways of doing things and no longer engage with the modern world, which makes politics like an elitist system because all politicians are elitist within the political bubble while they're keeping all the power to themselves. Lastly, the stakeholders of these political outsiders themselves. They can still be like experts, like doctors and engineers or community leaders, but just not that much experience in politics specifically. Their incentive is that they see a specific problem in their field. For example, a doctor sees a problem in the healthcare system and they want to represent those issues in politics. The capacity is that they have enough real world skills to know enough about their issue. But in the status quo, the rise is that they're too scared to represent themselves or unable to represent themselves in politics. Now, in this debate, Prop will show how we benefit all stakeholders to the maximum extent possible. But firstly, like a preemptory rebuttal. Now, they say that people might not be skilled enough to manage countries. For example, how can a doctor know how to make policies and make graphs and influence people? Two reasons why this will not be an issue. First, we have never said that these political outsiders are necessarily running for president or senators or office. These roles are including but not limited to these roles, right? They can still open up their voices and actively engage politics in their own way. There are many ways for one to take part in politics, not just becoming president or senator or doing all these technical jobs, right? Everyone can use their own skills and talents. Let's make an example. A musician or an artist like Taylor Swift, they know best how to influence people with social media and their art, etc. So that they might not necessarily be doing the most technical job, but can still have an impact. Secondly, most politicians, even in the status quo, are not standalones. They're not the ones making the graphs. They're often assisted by career experts. So these political outsiders can bring the voice and the vision, but they don't have to be the one accomplishing them. So it's our side's burden to prove to you that we are bridging the gap between the government and the people, leading to more practical and more beneficial laws for the majority of society. And it's OP's burden to prove to you that the status quo is working perfectly and that the current political elites are doing a flawless job. So we should actively fear and block new perspectives coming up. Moving on to my two substantive arguments and a third extension point that my deputy speaker will elaborate on. First argument, increase public engagement in politics. Now, in the status quo, President Nixon has brought up this idea of the silent majority, which is the reality in many countries and places today. The majority of people are seeing politics as something distant. They don't care about the leadership or think that changing leadership will not improve their existing issues. They are passively getting information from social media and not actively trying to break the bubble and care about politics. Why is this an issue? This leads to an echo chamber. Because without active public engagement, certain political parties will dominate over a long term. Because people will think that, oh, because everyone else voted for them, and after we've been voting for these people for many years, so why should we get more information and why should we change? May as well just vote for them without making an informed decision, right? And second of all, this leads to stagnation of social progress. Maybe many people do realize that social issues exist, but no, sorry, they're too tired as individuals to advocate for change. They need someone to represent them. For example, in the status quo, probably a lot of people do care about female rights, but they don't have enough free time to do extensive research on them because they don't care enough. But if Taylor Swift starts a campaign on feminism, this can actually influence political policies. The silent majority is allowing many social issues to fermentate and expand. So how does our world solve this? As characterized, people are more likely to care about stuff that relates to their daily life, like music, sports, commercialization, than abstract political concepts which seem very complicated and distant to them. There is nothing else that can motivate them to care about politics as much as their daily life, right? For example, if a hockey player starts doing politics, then all their fans will start to care. If a business manager, Morgan Stanley, starts doing it, then all their employees and all their clients will start to care. Now, the impact of this is that it gets people actively thinking about their rights and their real life issues, which can promote positive change instead of people just sitting still despite being uncomfortable about the status quo. Yes, accepted.
If the fans of people from other occupations now care about politics, would you not agree that this creates like biased voting? Because now you're voting for Taylor Swift just because you're a Swiftie and not because of her like political, not because of the actual policy she passes, for example.
We think that this will be an issue in some cases, but first of all, this is very extreme, right? I wouldn't just vote for a political leader just because I like her music. And second of all, at least it's better than on your side because you have no preference. You're not even getting information and thinking about who you like and who you dislike. At least in this case, this gets people more engaged about the political ideas that Taylor Swift represents, right? So on to my second argument about diverse representation. In the status quo, it's clear that some political problems are getting more time spent on them than others, right? Why? Because some groups are more active in politics and more influential than others. For example, currently in the status quo, it's a clear fact that governments are investing, for example, in diplomacy more than they do in, for example, cancer research. Now, Prop is not claiming that mainstream political goals such as diplomacy in the status quo are necessarily less important, but we say that many equally important things are getting underrepresented. For example, there are not enough, obviously not enough cancer patients or cancer doctors' public influence in politics. What is the harm of this issue? This especially harms minorities and the most vulnerable stakeholders because most politicians in the status quo are obviously currently in middle higher class with more like with higher social class, so they don't understand marginalized lives and the lives of these minorities, right? Even if they do have policies targeted towards these minorities, because they're not carefully designed, these politicians don't understand how to actually benefit these people. So how do we solve this issue? Because we have representation from different fields like arts, music, racial minorities, etc. This might not get them complete equal exposure, but certainly by comparative is a lot better than the status quo. Note that these people are people who actually have life experiences in these fields and groups and actually care about these rights. For example, an athlete will care about athlete rights and they have a real understanding of this situation looks like. Representation is important because it not just gives exposure. The more talking, the more doing. This will drive systematic change like policies, investments, funding, laws, and regulations, right? Because if no outsiders, then the existing politics have similar background life experiences. Therefore, this will lead to no representation for these minorities. Therefore, never priority propose. Thank you.
No human being can be an expert and be a professional at every field in life. Unfortunately, politicians are expected to be able to cater to every need of every ordinary person. It is impossible to come from a previous occupation that encompasses all of the above. It is unlikely that these people will be necessarily qualified to be politicians and to hold significant political positions, or at least it's unclear that they would be more qualified than a person with a background in politics. Okay, then, 3 things in my speech. Firstly, I'll talk about some points of setup as to what these political outsiders look like and why they choose to go into politics. Secondly, I'll talk about why you get worse policy. And then thirdly, I'll talk about why this politicizes the rest of society. All my responses will be integrated. So firstly, then, some points to set up. Why do these people necessarily choose to change from like a previous occupation that presumably was already going well for them, given that they were well known enough to already have a fan base? Why do these people choose to change into politics? Side opposition would have you note that this is likely because they care about the world, because they're just like incredibly passionate people. Why it's untrue? I think it's more likely that these people change for materialistic reasons, for reasons like power, like money, like fame, right? Why is this structurally true? Firstly, I think that just because people who are more cutthroat and people who are more quote selfishly ambitious are just empirically the ones who are likely to succeed more in politics, just because politics is an incredibly cutthroat environment. You need to be quite ambitious to be quite like selfish per se. And then secondly, given that they probably already have a previous established occupation and they've probably identified a way in which they can do societal good in their previous occupation, the fact that they choose to ignore that means of bettering society and then choose to go into politics it probably means that they're doing it for the power, because politics is unique in that, like, if you're the president or the prime minister of the country, you are genuinely the most powerful person in that country. I think it's more likely they chose to go into politics uniquely for that reason, especially given that you're able to do activism in any other field anyway. So what does that mean? I think this means that these people probably originally corrupt or originally had bad intentions. They were not the most altruistic people. They were not the people who cared about society the most. That looks like people like Imran Khan, like of Pakistan, or like Donald Trump coming from business, for example. Why then is it more likely for this type and not, and why is it likely that you're not going to get diversity then? Two reasons for this broadly. Firstly, I think that the barrier of entry into politics is already incredibly high. You need like a lot of education, you need connections, you need like, and for all of that, you need money, right? I think that the barrier of entry is incredibly high, which means that the political outsiders that you're getting who go into politics are probably already from privileged backgrounds. It looks like things like CEOs, like incredibly famous actors, like etc. People like that, people like Donald Trump, who were already basically like nepo babies, right? I think that you're unlikely to get an incredibly disadvantaged person in a particularly high position of power anyway, because they do not have the necessary funds and the necessary connections to actually make it that high. Secondly, I think like ordinary people can make a change elsewhere, and that it's probably more effective for them to make a change elsewhere. That looks like things like activism, right? So that mostly deals with opposition material on like social trust and progress, because we prove to you why the types of people in these fields are corrupt and are not necessarily quite diverse. Okay, then on to substantive. Firstly, why do we get worse policy? Generally, like 4 mechs for this. Firstly, I think that it's pretty intuitive that people who do not have a background in politics are just less theoretically qualified than people who have spent their entire lives in politics. Just simply because they do not have political experience. I think that's pretty self-explanatory. And the counterfactual, if someone has spent their entire lives in the political scheme, it's pretty certain, or like it's pretty probable that they are going to be like a good leader, or at least a decent leader. I think that doesn't apply for the alternative. What does being a bad leader necessarily look like? I think that I alluded to this in my intro, but it probably looks like you not considering the implications of your policy on other fields, things like tunnel vision, things like if you have an athlete as a president and they care lots about athletes' rights, they probably don't care about other people's rights, right? They like, for example, or if they're an environmentalist, they might overspend into the environment and cause mass inflation and then like decrease the quality of life for most people. I think that particularly, this mechanism applies regardless of their personal sentiment. That is, even if they are a really good person, even if they are not corrupt, like they still probably are unqualified simply because they were not from politics. I think that looks like Ronald Reagan's like Reaganomics being kind of bad, like stuff like that applies regardless of whether or not they were originally corrupt. Before I move on, I'll take a PY.
POI.
Yep.
You have said that political outsiders are probably just nepo babies, just like regular politicians. But isn't it more likely for you to succeed with just your talent in fields like sports or arts as compared to like pure politic fields?
But what I'm saying is, people who have already succeeded in sports or like arts are like only the very, very best of those people, or only the very, very like the most popular or the most outstanding people in other fields would be able to even be remotely successful in politics. I think that those people are not the most vulnerable people. The most vulnerable people will never be able to make it big in politics. That's what I'm trying to say. Second mechanism as to why we get worse policy is that like these people are just likely to be like manipulated, just that they don't have their set views, they don't have their set, they're inexperienced. If they are like not cutthroat and if they are not ambitious, they're probably like to be influenced by people like their own party or like other world leaders, etc. They're probably not going to be a very good leader. Thirdly, I think that lots of times these people just have conflicts of interest in that they probably care lots about their previous occupation, and as such are likely to go for bills that benefit them previously, and that's necessarily undemocratic or that would cause worse policy. So for example, Clive Palmer, like an Australian politician who owns a lot of mines, is always like, oh, we should go big on mines, we should like have more mines. Or conversely, if you're a CEO of like an environmental technology company, you probably overspend on the environment, you probably don't care as much about the economy, for example, things like that. Fourthly, I think they get less accountability because the performance of the politician is judged based on their previous occupation and not based on their political performance. So, for example, people saying that Trump is like, oh, really good for the economy because he was a really good businessman and like not actually considering what he's done for the economy as a politician, etc. What are the impacts of this? Firstly, I think that politics just gets worse and that has huge impacts. Like I think I've gone through them sufficiently. And then secondly, I think that you get more corruption. I think that leaders like you get less accountability and as such worse leaders. For those reasons, proud to oppose.
The assumptions that opposition makes in their first speech lies at the faulty core of their case. What they give you today is 7 minutes of substantive on how, oh, the political outsiders are simply inexperienced and too amateur to do this, do this policy. But Judge, you have to understand that the real political system is much more complicated and goes far beyond that, right? The real status quo is that politics today is not exclusive to the outside world. What this means is that most leaders have grown up in a bubble, right? So they forget what it is like to worry about taxes, worry about a faulty medical system, and worry about their huge monthly bills and inflation. They don't understand people's actual concern and just operate in an extremely high hierarchy with elitist opinions, not popular one. This is what corrupts our entire society. So proud to propose. As the DPM, three things in my speech: rebuttals, extension, and rebuilding if time allows. Firstly, a very important piece of rebuttal. They say that many people in these political outside groups are already privileged, for example, CEOs or artists. But Donald Trump already has many money and resources. So we think that political outsiders are probably Nepo babies, just like regular politicians, so they won't be able to understand real life struggles. But like politics is exclusive, right? You need a lot of money and social connections. Whereas like we said in our POIs, these athletes and artists, at least by comparison, are more likely to succeed with their talents and their ideas. Even if, okay, our world, say only the top one musician or the top one economics will be able to get represented, at least these people are more likely to succeed with skill and talent. So they are more likely to understand real life struggle. Then if you pick the top one politician, they are most likely coming from rich family with family connections, right? Secondly, they claim that political outsiders are inexperienced and will produce bad policies. Three layers of rebuttal here. One, as already framed by the PM, they will be running for office or something. These roles are included but not limited to, so they can engage in their own ways with politics. Secondly, these knowledge and skills are just knowing how to maintain the status quo. Right? What do we need to prioritize today? Better policies or a simple lack of knowledge? Outsiders can learn about the political system, but for someone growing up in a really rich background and a really elitist background, they can't learn about real things happening outside because they've lived in this entire bubble practically their entire lives. Thirdly, leaders just need to be visionaries, right? An outsider can have advisors, but what is valuable about them is that they have specialized knowledge on specific issues in society. Thirdly, they claim that they will be biased. Two layers of rebuttals. Firstly, we think that this is non-comparative on their side and potentially even worse, right? They say, oh, you only care about Taylor Swift because you're a Swiftie, but many people only vote for leaders because others vote for them or because they have been leaders for a long time. How do you prove that in your world, people are voting for leaders because they actually agree on their political ideas? Secondly, on their side, there's no preference, no thinking, and no considering happening. Secondly, it's more likely than not supporting an artist or an athlete already means that you agree with their views to some content. Like, I wouldn't love Taylor Swift just because she looks good, right? Because I like her music and her personality, likely this means that I already support her vision of, say, gender equality and women's rights and personal growth, which proves that she would be a good political advocate, even if she doesn't have any experience in the political field. Yes, I will take your point of information.
If people vote for someone because they have been in politics for a long time, if you compare that to voting for someone because you like their music, don't you think that it's more reasonable for that someone who has been voted in because they've been in politics for a long time would be a better leader?
I literally just mentioned this, right? We don't vote. People don't just like Taylor Swift, for example, for her music, right? They like Taylor Swift because she has ideas about, for example, gender equality, and they think that she will be a good advocate for this idea. Music is just an added portion to it, right? People will have some moral ground here, so they will not just mindlessly vote for Taylor Swift because she's an excellent singer. Because politicians directly affect people's lives here, they will not risk their own lives to vote for Taylor Swift, for example. Now moving on to extensions, which is that it reduces corruptions as these outsiders have no conflict of interest or institutional baggage. The status quo here is that the political system is very elitist, and these politicians have the exact same background, so they don't have any idea of what happens in an ordinary person's life or what their concerns are. And outsiders from from the real world, like business, like they work in careers like businesses, medicine, the medicine field, and activism, and who understand the underlying complexities of the problems in society, in the status quo. We see this in the status quo where many of our society's policies, such as the corrupt medical system already, is harming thousands and millions of people. And this just proves that that the current status quo, where people who are experienced from these politics, when they come up, no, I will not take your POI due to protected time. This just further proves why the current leaders in today's society that are not political outsiders have not done their job historically. The impact of this is that there is more social trust. So if ASOW keeps utilizing people from the elitist system and carry on this status quo, obviously people will protest because the status quo is just flawed. As mentioned in the burden, ASOW's burden is to prove that the status quo is working perfectly and that the current political elites are just doing such a flawless job that we should actively fear and block any new perspectives from coming up. Therefore, because of the countless flaws in the status quo and in the historical system and existing corruption in terms of public's trust in the status quo, this argument is exclusive and unique to our side and will cause significant aftermath and backlash, such as corruption. So the opposition is asking you to choose the certainty of failure because they are scared of the risk of change. But in a sinking ship, think about this. The most dangerous thing you can do is stay still, right? We would rather have a leader who doesn't know the rules of the game but knows how to fix a problem than a politician who knows the rules perfectly but refuses to advocate for their main stakeholder, which are the minorities and most vulnerable populations in our entire population. Thank you.
In a debate, we don't actually have to prove that our side is perfect. 3 questions. First, why are these predominantly bad leaders? Second of all, why does this lead to worse policy and worse representation? Lastly, on the trust in politics. But additionally, lastly, even if we take them at their absolute best, why these figures would be better able to achieve change outside of politics. First of all, let's discuss why these people are going to be bad leaders. The reason why this is so important is because their claim largely relies on this characterization of the political activist, the musician that's actively doing good for society. We think the reality of this debate is that it's predominantly people like businessmen, and that's the way they get into politics. The reason why this should give us the debate based on this factor is that people like businessmen tend to have bad interests. For example, they want to make lots of money for their own company, so that characterization is more favorable to us. Even if characterization like environmental activists is more favorable to them, we should win the debate based on the fact that it's the majority of business makers. Why is this true? Well, firstly, we pointed out at MIA to no response that you had to be pretty cutthroat to succeed in politics. You had to be able to make deals with people to try and get into positions of power. You had to negotiate deals with lobbyists to try and get money to get your campaign off the ground. You had to be pretty cynical to be able to fight back against your opponents, to hate them so much that you were going to drive forward to succeed. You had to be pretty cutthroat. And the reality was, nice people just often couldn't make it in politics. But additionally, we told you needed to have power existingly to get into politics, especially since you were so behind from the current political standing. That is, you needed an enormous amount of money. Because think about it, if you're a musician, there is no way that you can get into a position of politics because it is so competitive. So you need an enormous amount of power behind you before you can enter it, which we think it is largely going to be people like businessmen, for example, Donald Trump. Even if that's not true, let's get into the first claim, the first clash then, which is on the quality of politics. Of policy. The first thing I'm going to do is respond to their claims, and then I'll whip our material, which was not responded to by them. Their first claim is that, well, you're going to have been grown up in a bubble. Firstly, this is not proven. We think many politicians did not grow up in a bubble. For example, Anthony Albanese lived in public housing. He is the Prime Minister of Australia right now. And the structural reason is people want to vote in leaders that are like them. Oftentimes people are not super privileged, and therefore they will vote in leaders from poor backgrounds. But secondly, we think even if this is not true, it is utterly symmetrical. Last time I checked, Taylor Swift had over $1 billion. Her father was super rich. The reason why was because you needed privilege to succeed in these industries. You needed things like expensive schools to succeed in business. You needed things like lots of money to pay for guitar teachers so that you could become an elite musician. You needed things like connections so that you could get your art out there in society. It was not clear why the grown up in a bubble wasn't true on their side. Let's explain then why we are so much better for this claim on being grown up in a bubble. Listen, panel, think about what a politician does. Most of their job is going out and talking to people, is going out onto the streets, knocking on doors and saying, you should vote for my party, tell me about your struggles. And the reason why is because politicians need to engage with the community for the community to engage with them, which means politicians get a huge variety of perspectives, including the least privileged. So the politicians uniquely are the ones that pop the bubble, not people like actors. That's their first claim to deal with. Their second claim is that, well, you're going to focus on specific issues and bring unique perspectives. The first problem with this argument is that you can be exposed to these issues through other means. For example, politicians have advisors, activists, lobbyists, staff from varying backgrounds, public hearings where the public can interact with them. It is unclear why you need to be from this industry to understand the different problems, for example, with the medical system. Why is this actually sufficient? Well, I would note that politicians, it is literally their job to listen to people's perspectives and take them on and understand them. If you cannot effectively understand people, then you cannot effectively deliver outcomes and you get voted out, which is why politicians are very effective at understanding and consolidating these different political perspectives. The reason that is so bad on their side is because the person that might be an expert actor or an expert climate analyst only knows about climate analysts, only knows about the issues in healthcare or in art. They do not have the ability to deal with the vast majority of other issues, which are much more or equally important than the ones that they describe. So we win the clash on specific issues. The next thing then is they say, well, it's not effective because you don't have to be the prime minister. You can just engage in a non-political political role. I'm sorry, this is a debate about politics. These people are going to be entering into political roles. For example, Ronald Reagan. For example, Donald Trump. But I would note, even if we take them at their absolute best here, the problems that they identify are symmetrical because if I'm a person that was going to vote for Taylor Swift, right, I'm a person that cares a lot about feminism. And so if the public was going to vote for Taylor Swift, they would probably vote for a feminist politician on either side of the house. The delta then was people that were actually going to be effective at implementing that policy were uniquely under our side. Let's then explain all the material that they dropped under our side. Firstly, we told you there was bias and decreased accountability. Their response here was, well, you're more likely to engage in this because you're thinking about the politician, because you're actually engaging with them. The problem is, if you look at Taylor Swift, most people aren't that politically informed. They're just going to vote on the back of Taylor Swift being the music actor that I like. That claim relies on the characterization of people saying, oh, Taylor Swift's cool, I'm going to now research the efficacy of Taylor Swift. The problem was those voters just said Taylor Swift cool and then voted for her. There was no reason as to why that was likely to be true. The next three claims that we told you were, first, efficacy, and do not underestimate this argument. Effectiveness was super important because it was the prerequisite to getting any kind of change. For example, the difference between a Green politician and a Green advocate. A Green politician knows how to work within Parliament. They know how to advocate their beliefs. They know how to convince the public that this is good because it takes an enormous amount of skill to be an effective politician. But additionally, we told you there were lots of things that you need to do as a politician that just required a lot of expertise so that you could keep the community running and effective. So they didn't respond to that. Then we told you about manipulation, which they did not respond to, which was people that were rookies in politics could easily be lied to because they did not have the real experience of people being used, and therefore they could be manipulated easily by other people. But second, they lacked political power because they were new to politics, which meant they needed to be manipulated and suck up to other people in order to succeed, which decreased policy outcomes. Before I go on to the last reason, POI.
POI.
Yeah, go.
Earlier you mentioned in the start how people who succeed in politics are likely very cutthroat. But why does caring about a certain group's rights and being willing to alpha necessarily make them a not nice and a bad person?
It doesn't. I'm not saying that that group is bad. I'm saying that people that get selected from that group are bad because they are uniquely the ones that can enter politics. The last thing we told you was they got tunnel vision. For example, they focused excessively on the environment. The second thing I'll do is respond to their clash on decreased trust in politics. First, this is symmetrical because the media has an incentive to drum everything up anyway and say these politicians are bad on either side. Second of all, we can fix distrust in the establishment through other means, for example, by electing anti-establishment politicians, such as Zoran Mandani, who uniquely has had an enormously political career. But thirdly, we flip this argument because we improve policy, which directly means that we get increased outcomes. Lastly then, why are we better able to achieve change outside of the system? First, because we're able to push more pure messaging. You have to be subject to funding, to political interests, to the constituencies on their side of the House, which means you can't effectively enforce your environmental policy as effectively. Second, you lose voter base because it becomes politicized. Half of the people that don't vote for your political party now are ostracized from the climate movement. Third, people lose trust in you precisely for the reason they identify, that is, people don't trust politicians. So even if we take them at their best, these are beautiful environmental activists, they could better achieve change outside of the system. Proud to oppose.
The opposition has been asserting for the whole time that politicians will just be able to understand the hardships of minorities and push through policies for them just because they want their votes. And the experiences of a politician is the only thing that keeps our society stable and going, which is simply not true. Proud to propose. So firstly, starting with some rebuttals. Opposition said that politicians will vote for someone people will just vote for someone because they like the celebrity advocating for them. However, we believe that this argument is just fundamentally flawed for several reasons. Firstly, we think that a radical person understands that voting is a very serious decision that can greatly influence their daily lives, whether or not that they have been in politics before or engaged in politics before, right? Because they know that policies can shape their life daily. While they may be initially drawn to a celebrity and interested because of politics because of this celebrity, voters are not simply just choosing a candidate based on their fame or likability. Instead, I think what is more tangible to happen is that they recognize that their vote can impact important issues like education, healthcare, and job opportunities. So this awareness can also encourage them to think more critically about the candidate and their policies, rather than just making a very brutal decision based solely on a celebrity's endorsement. For instance, if a very well-known actor advocates for education reform, fans who might not be interested in politics before, what may happen is that they can watch their speech and then feel inspired to learn more about the issues rather than just voting simply just because they like the celebrity. It is more likely that they can start some research about the proposed policies and engage with the political process. This can lead to more informed electorates, which can be more capable of making better decisions with that can be truly reflecting their values and needs. And secondly, we think that this celebrity advocacy can serve as a bridge to deeper political engagement because when a celebrity speaks more about political issues, it can also ignite the interest in topics that voters who might not have considered this before, even if that person is already formally interested in politics. Because as people see their favorite public figures discussing about important issues that they never noticed before, they can become more motivated to educate themselves and participate more actively in politics in that area. So I think this engagement is far more meaningful than simply a celebrity endorsement. And thirdly, the involvement of celebrities can also highlight diverse issues that can connect and resonate with various communities because celebrity advocates often bring more attention to important issues that can motivate people to consider different perspectives. So this can lead to a more diverse and engaged voter base, which rather than simply a shallow following of a celebrity. Yes, POI.
If Taylor Swift cared so much about politics, could she not engage the public by talking about politics while not actually being a politician herself?
I think it can still change and shape politics because when the person is advocating, for example, on a campaign or giving speeches, just because of their reputation and their public popularity as a whole, if people are actually interested about that issue and that issue is something actually pressing on society, I think this can actually gain a lot of public attention and support, which I think can also push the government to make a change. So now moving on to the clashes in this debate. Firstly, the clash on representation of diversity. So Prop believes that political outsiders can bring various varied life experiences that can enrich politics. So opposition has claimed that political outsiders, they can lack a lot of political experience to sustain their movement, which can lead to a lot of chaos, and they're usually only interested about the part that they represent, right? However, we believe that this is simply untrue because of two reasons. Firstly, political outsiders do not need to run for top positions like president or senator to make a very significant impact, right? So this because they simply already just didn't listen to our setup. They can engage in politics by giving speeches, participating in campaigns, and advocating for their views on social media. This means that they can still influence discussions and mobilize and advocate for support around very important issues without holding a formal political office. We believe that this is definitely also a very good and significant kind of political engagement anyways. So they don't necessarily have to run for president just like the DLO said. However, they can still make a lot of significant changes in politics because if a political outsider starts to campaign around, for example, climate change and gains a lot of public attention, the government will still feel very pressured to address this issue. So this influence can also lead to improved policies based on logical evaluation of the government rather than just pure chaos. And secondly, the engagement of political outsiders won't result in a very narrow view on just, for example, one issue on one side. Because as these outsiders come from, like with this rise, these outsiders will be more and more, and they come from various backgrounds and occupations anyways. So they can represent a very wide range of concerns and interests. We can see environmental activists advocating for climate policies, business leaders pushing for economic growth, or athletes promoting for better equality and laws for these athletes. So all these voices can contribute together to a more balanced dialogue within politics. So this diversity can also mean that multiple issues are addressed simultaneously by the government rather than just causing a very unbalanced focus on a single topic. So let's compare the worlds. Opposition world in this clash is that most traditional politicians who dominate the whole political landscape comes from privileged backgrounds who don't understand the pain from minorities, the underprivileged. And even if they know that there's the pain, they don't truly understand because they just don't actually have the experience themselves. So which can lead to policies that is only for elites and promotes laws for the elites and big companies, while this bad cycle can cause worse life conditions for the minority and even less politicians representing and advocating for minorities because they don't even have the foundation to compete in politics. So people are blinded by thinking that these issues can't be changed forever because it just works like that. So which can lead to a very bad cycle and social inequality. However, on proposition world, there are political outsiders from various fields like business, activism, entertainment, education, etc., which can allow them to represent a broader spectrum of the society. And even more, these outsiders who might come from like minority groups can also push for a more inclusive political environment where all voices are heard and considered. So because the op cannot prove simply how politicians have a full incentive and will be able to push for policies for minorities, proposition obviously wins this clash. As thinking clash about political engagement and informedness, we believe that political outsiders often resonate more with the public, particularly disenfranchised and apathetic voters, and then their presence can significantly enhance voter engagement. So in opposition world, what happens? A lot of people are not interested in politics because they feel like it's either not related to them, it's not interesting, feels like the politicians like speech are too complicated, or not interested in the politicians, or just not happy about the current laws and status quo and feel like it's not going to change anyways, which can lead to low turnout rates and laws that don't like actually benefit them. However, on proposition world, so outsiders can come from these non-political backgrounds, which can make them more relatable to everyday citizens, right? So their experiences can motivate more people to participate in the political process. And political outsiders can also utilize social media and other like modern communication tools more effectively than traditional politicians. So by engaging with voters directly and authentically, they can also mobilize support and increase turnout rates. And thirdly, some political outsiders are celebrities who have substantial political following. So we think that this can also encourage more voters to engage in politics overall. Therefore, never been prouder to propose. Thank you.
The first thing I want to talk about before even beginning to breach into the whole mass of material that both sides have given you about policy and about public engagement is just which side creates change. Because I think that was something that both sides of the House decided ought to happen. But the problem was change wasn't going to happen under side proposition. And the reasons were more like, I think, obvious than you think, right? There has been a debate, which I think you may have seen before, that goes that students who have engaged in political behaviors, like, for example, attending protests, should not go into parliament. The reasons for why this was the case were quite obvious. They were that parliament existed and politicians, the act of going into politics, was something that often became inherently corrupting. So as we tell you from first to no response, the amount of, cutthroat kind of deals that you have to make, about how you have to be a bit selfish, about how you have to preserve your own self-interest. Those were not faults necessarily of democracy. They were just things that happened because of the competitive nature of parliament and of government, and because of how people wanted power in these instances and how they wanted to succeed. This meant a couple of things. Firstly, it meant that if you were able to create change as an activist, it was better for you to stay in that role. So essentially, for example, if people like Taylor Swift or Emma Watson advocated for gender rights, they ought to stay in that role of being an activist where they could advocate for gender rights. The reasons were plenty and not responded to by side proposition. Firstly, they just had less constraints on the things they could reasonably talk about or reasonably approach. So for instance, they were free to dedicate all of their time to doing things like advocate for genders, or they were free to do all of their time doing things like advocating to climate change instead of necessarily needing to spread out their time across a variety of areas, as is entailed in the job description of a politician, as my second speaker talked about. But secondly, it just meant that they were free from the necessary corruption and cutthroat nature of the industry that came with politics. And they were also more able to do things like hold the existing government accountable instead of being part of the problem or being part of the government that meant that they were unable to, create the necessary change. What this means at the end of this, what I mean is, sure, maybe as someone who came from a different background, you had diverse take them at their best, right? Which is just that someone who came into parliament had diverse backgrounds and had strong views about certain issues. Our push is that you could do more of those things if you were not directly involved in politics. You had more time and opportunity to spend advocating for gender rights or advocating for climate change, and you were less susceptible to the inherent corruption that often came in tow with politics. Therefore, you ought leave the policy making and you ought leave the mistakes and the flaws and the things that should be changed to the politicians, whose direct job description was them having to talk to a bunch of people and having to create a bunch of policy. The system of checks and balances are what enables genuine change to be created. That was the thing that we ought not remove. Okay, in that case then, let's talk about public engagement. Their claim is very simple. They say that people engage more when the politicians involved in topics of interest to them, like for example sports or art. I have three responses. Firstly, I would note that people in the status quo do engage in politics, and this is for two reasons. Firstly, I think there is just a general rise in political engagement with the new generation. Like for example, my second speaker gave you the example of Zohra Mamdani, who goes around in New York City and talks to everyone and therefore creates public engagement. But secondly, I think politics was just something that was close to people's hearts. And also, I would note that just because you didn't express your political opinion or you didn't feel the need to say it doesn't mean that you weren't politically engaged. Doesn't just because you didn't announce to everyone that you supported Trump or that you supported Harris doesn't mean that you still had those opinions and you were still able to form them. That was a mistake made under their side. But also just the existence of things like, for example, in Australia where we live, things like youth parliament or model UN, or things that generally get kids into into political engagement was still existent, and a quote taken from how many years back shouldn't be reflective of the current state of political engagement. But secondly, I think that even if it is true that they get more engagement, this was just bad engagement that didn't deal with policy, because often what happens is there is a large group of voters in the middle who are yet to be swung. So for example, swing states in America, like swing voters who are yet undecided about which politician they're going to vote for, and they choose based on the policy that they see throughout election day. So what I would put is that in the days leading up to an election, there is a massive amount of emphasis on the differences in policy under both opponents. So that is, for example, debates, or that is, for example, just the showing of policy. What that means was that people were able to form their opinion based on what is arguably the most important thing when it comes to a politician's career: policy, right? So because they were able to see this information that was gathering at their fingertips and use it to make a decision. The problem under their side is, as we've stated along the bench, is that when Taylor Swift runs for government, the hundreds upon thousands upon millions of Swifties there will almost immediately definitely vote for her, because that was where their biases lean towards. So that engagement was one in which policy was discarded in favor of, for instance, their background as a businessman, their background as an artist, their background as a sport, when it turns out these people might have not really been good leaders at all. And the example we would give you, as stated in first, is like Imran Khan, who was a famous cricketer in Pakistan, who then is now arrested for charges of corruption. Okay. Thirdly, then, I also think that politicians have direct incentives to engage and to force engagement, which is why engagement is unlikely to be as low as they presume. But thirdly, I think alternatives exist. So I would relate this back to my first theme/intro, which is that alternatives to promoting awareness for certain issues, such as, for example, gender equality, was better done through advocacy, because the people who did these things were able to focus their resources intensely on one particular issue and bring change in that way instead of needing to spread all these things out. What does this mean for the debate? It means that firstly, we are the side that are more able to claim better public engagement, I think, because that is the point at which your favorite celebrities, for example, could tell you to engage in politics and that you didn't immediately choose to vote for them. It was also the side at which people could maybe silently engage with politics, but still engage without the necessary biases of their favorite sports person or their favorite artist joining into the political sphere. Okay. Lastly, then, on policy, they tell you that there is a greater diversity in policies. Two responses. Firstly, just because you have diversity, that doesn't equate to good policy. I think they are missing a bunch of links here. reasonably like two different kinds of people who come from different backgrounds might both be able to make good policy or might both be able to make bad policy. That's not dependent on that. It's probably more dependent on the factors that more incumbent politicians are able to have, like for example, like vast political experience, like for example the resources to go out and talk to people and to see what they want, in comparison to more diverse people who probably lack those resources and whose talents and efforts should be spent towards advocacy and acting as a system of checks and balances towards these peoples. For all those reasons, because let's remember Donald Trump, because let's remember Imran Khan, let's remember all of the politicians who came from other fields that failed, proud to negate. Thank you.
4 questions. First, what backgrounds do these people come from? Second, who gets better policy? Third, who gets better voter engagement? First, what do these people look like? We told you they came predominantly from bad backgrounds, such as business. Opposition's main push is these people come from backgrounds like healthcare. That is, after all, the premise of their case. If you don't believe these people come from backgrounds like healthcare, then you don't believe their material about people getting access to new kinds of perspectives, such as those from healthcare, such as those from education. We gave you 2 reasons. First, we told you you needed to be cutthroat to succeed in politics. After all, politics was about competing with others to achieve power. And so it predominantly looked like backstabbing people, it predominantly looked like making negotiations with others, being a hard person that people thought could lead the political party in an effective way. So you needed to be cutthroat to succeed in politics, which meant there was a filtering effect towards individuals that were already cutthroat, such as those from business. But second, we thought that you needed a lot of political power to actually enter these positions. The reason why was because you were on the back foot. You were competing against people that had political careers, and so you needed a large amount of money, a large amount of political support to enter into the first place. While athletes and musicians do have a lot of power, they simply lack the money and connections to enter. Who do we think actually has those connections? Is people like businessmen, is people that run oil mines. That is clearly worse because there is an enormous conflict of interests. Note, for example, Clive Palmer advocating pro-mining policy because he owns a lot of mines. So, second question then. Who gets better policy? We gave you 4 claims that were not responded to effectively. First, that there's tunnel vision. Second, that they're more easily manipulated. Third, that they lack experience. Fourth, fifth, that they understand people better as politicians. And additionally, there's more accountability. For example, they base it more on what they did in the past rather than their past political performance. I think we win that issue. The next thing they try and win on is this issue on voter engagement. But I think we sufficiently watched this out. First, we explained that it's symmetrical, because the media has an incentive to make you hate politicians on either side because it drives engagement. This was in our speech, by the way. I said it quite fast, but I still said it, and so it is something that you have to credit. The reason why is because the media wants people to engage, so it has an incentive to make people angry, and so people will be upset at the system on either side. But second, we told you that we could elect politicians that were anti-establishment. So if their concern was people don't like the establishment, then we can elect politicians like Zoran Mandami that push back. But last, I said in a POI that these people can engage out of politics anyway. So if they wanted to say Taylor Swift talking about politics is good, well, Taylor Swift can talk about politics, just she doesn't become a politician. And we think for a variety of reasons, as we told you at Serena, that is significantly better because she's not politicized, because she can spend more time on the actual process of activism itself. But last, we told you there was an incentive to cater to voter interests on either side, which meant that this was largely symmetrical. Here's the weighing here. The first thing, the reason why we should weigh policy effectiveness over this is on logical priority. Because think about it. Why do people not trust politicians? It's because they think that politicians don't get effective outcomes for them. And so what's likely to happen is they elect Taylor Swift, and then, or not Taylor Swift, they elect someone like, I don't know, Ronald Reagan, and then they don't get the outcomes that they want, and they get even more frustrated. Whereas on our side, they elect someone that has a similar sort of perspective as the environmental advocates, if that's what they wanted to characterize, but they actually achieve the outcomes. And that's how we heal the kind of voter engagement problem that they wanted to engage with. But second, we told you it was a more certain outcome because they provided you with no link whatsoever as to why having these people in politics would lead to more engagement, but they also didn't explain why more engagement in politics leads to better outcomes. What we explained was a far more certain impact, which is when you had people that knew what they were doing in politics, they were likely to deliver good outcomes for people because that's how they got re-elected. So you should weigh it on certainty. But lastly, we told you that even if these people entered politics, it was actually better that they stayed out of it. Why? We told you at Serena that they get corrupted to no response. We told you that they're able to spend more time on enforcing their activism. We were told that they had to make sacrifices like catering to certain lobby groups or certain constituencies to succeed. So even if it was the advocates that they wanted to characterize, we think it was actually better that they stayed out of politics because they could more effectively achieve change that way.
Let proposition make one thing very clear to you. Now, no politician or no human being can care about every social issue that exists, and we would rather have different people caring about different issues. But before I begin my reply speech, one clarification and one call. First, clarification. They have talked about the definition of being in politics. They say that Taylor Swift can talk about politics, but not engage and be a politician. But why is talking not enough? Because currently in the status quo, she does not count as a politician. Why? Because all she does is, for example, write songs and sends a couple of blogs, and she has limited impact because she cannot concretely make, for example, female right policies exist. But if she starts to lead large-scale campaigns and actually affect these government policy, this means that she has a real governmental and political impact, which automatically makes her taking part in a political field. Not just because she's not running for president doesn't mean that she's not affecting politics, right? Now, calling out one thing that they said that we find ridiculous. They say that these politicians, these political outsiders will become cutthroat, backstabbing, for example, businessmen for only want money for their own companies. This is a part of human nature that you cannot solve, okay? Everyone wants the best of the group that they represent, but at least in our world, we have these so-called cutthroat, backstabbing people from every group, not just from some dominant groups, to actively push for the benefits and rights for every group, right? The existence of these leaders who care a lot, who care enough to want to fight other parties and groups are beneficial and necessary, because without these cutthroat, so-called cutthroat people, some groups don't get to push for their rights because most people are unable to push for these rights or don't care enough to want to push. We don't understand why people who want their rights and welfare and profit for the groups that they represent is necessarily a bad thing for society and make them bad people, right? Now, on to recharacterizing both the politicians and political outsiders. We want to compare these two choices, and we're not saying that this is just about good and bad policies. The status quo, the issue in the status quo is that some social issues have no policy at all that represent them, before you even compare the quality of the policies. So let's look at this from two angles, the political vision and political skill. Now, political vision. We have told you repeatedly that what one believes in and what one values is largely shaped by the issues that they're facing and they're witnessing in their own lives, right? For example, doctors will care more about underfunding in cancer research because they are the ones affected and they see patients and families being affected. They have told you that politics, like I quote directly from the Prime Minister, they say politics require a lot of money and family connections, which means that they directly admitted themselves that in the status quo, most politicians come from family lines running down generations with similar background, lots of money and resources, etc. The political outsiders, on the other hand, they say that we will also have the bubble. For example, Taylor Swift had a rich dad. She need money to pay for her guitar lessons, but at least it's more likely on our side that athletes and artists, for example, are more likely to be able to make their break and succeed with their own skills and ideas and talents than, say, politicians who come from like rich families, right? And they say that our side does not actively engage with the public, but politicians don't knock on random neighbors' doors and ask them what the problem they care about is, right? Their work setting looks like engaging with companies, other politicians, and lobbyists, these people who also live in the political bubble, so they have less connection with the real outside world. Whereas on our side, these political outsiders, for example, artists connect with their audience, doctors connect with their patients, so they interact mostly with the very people that they are advocating for. Now, political skill, I think that this is parallel on both sides, because we have shown you as early as in the first speech that even in the status quo, most politicians are in effect not the ones calculating the numbers or writing up the policies or enforcing their laws. It's not on their side their politicians have any hard skills that our side is unable to match. So what if Taylor Swift cannot write a law? Now, we have shown you how political representation is the driving force and the guidance that shifts the allocation of time and resources. Without the big direction and without someone caring about this issue, no one will care about the issue and no one will be writing up the numbers and writing up the laws. Now, lastly, a short world comparison. On their side, their best case scenario is that the power is stable, no political fights, and some politicians care about some people's rights, but their progress is stagnated and they care about a limited scope of rights and issues. Because, for example, politicians who care about international diplomacy will always care about diplomacy more than other issues. On our side, the worst case scenario is that there are some political outsiders who are selfish and power hungry and only care about their own rights and their own groups. But at least on our world, every group has someone pushing and fighting for them. People are not just sitting there being, I quote from my first speech, the silent majority, letting politics go on like a TV show in the background without wanting change and solutions to their issues, right? Therefore, for all these above reasons, never empowered to propose. Thank you.